History Secrets.
In the first centuries of Christianity, the idea of the end of the world was not a distant abstraction. It was a living expectation. Present in the way people thought, acted, and interpreted the reality around them. But what exactly were they expecting? A cosmic collapse? An immediate judgment? Or a deeper transformation of time itself? To understand this expectation, we need to return to the context in which Christianity emerged. The first century was a period of intense tension in the Jewish world. Roman domination, social crises, and a strong hope for divine intervention. Many Jews expected a moment when God would restore justice, an event that would completely change the order of the world. This expectation was not vague. It was rooted in prophetic texts, such as those in the book of Daniel, where visions of kingdoms, judgment, and renewal appear in symbolic form, and also in apocalyptic traditions circulating in that period. These ideas formed the background of Jesus' teachings and deeply influenced the first Christians. But here, a crucial point arises. Jesus spoke about the end, but not always in the way we imagine today. In the Gospels, we find discourses that directly address this theme. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, Jesus describes signs, tribulations, and the coming of the Son of Man. But these words were not necessarily understood as something distant. For many listeners, they indicated near events, something that could happen within that generation. This perception appears even more clearly in the early Christian communities, especially in the letters attributed to Paul of Tarsus. In the first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 4, he speaks about the coming of the Lord and the resurrection of the dead. But the most significant detail is in the tone. He includes himself among those who would still be alive at that moment, as if the event were imminent. This reveals something important. The first Christians did not see the end as a distant idea, but as a concrete and near possibility, and this deeply shaped the way they lived. This expectation of imminence generated a specific kind of mindset, a life oriented toward the present, but with attention fixed on what was to come. There was urgency, vigilance, and, in many cases, detachment from established social structures. But not everyone interpreted this expectation in the same way. Some communities emphasized immediate proximity. Others began to face an inevitable issue. Time passed, and the end did not arrive. This created tension, doubts, and the need to reinterpret the received words. Something there needed to be reconsidered. This tension appears clearly in later texts. In the second letter of Peter, chapter 3, we find a direct response to this issue. There it is stated that for God, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day. This statement is not only theological, it is an attempt to resolve a concrete problem, the apparent delay of the end. This introduces a significant change in how time is understood. What was once perceived as immediate becomes understood as indeterminate, and that alters the entire structure of Christian expectation. But this was not the only response. Other traditions began to reinterpret the very meaning of the end. Instead of a purely future event, Some began to understand the end as something that had already begun, a transformation in progress, a new reality inaugurated with the life and message of Jesus. This idea appears, for example, in passages from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, where it is stated that the kingdom of God is among you. This suggests that the end is not only destruction, but also revelation, a transformation of perception, a new way of understanding reality. And this opens a new layer of interpretation, the end as inner transformation, and not only as an external event. But this was not the only current present in that period. There were also texts and traditions outside the canon that offered different visions. In the Shepherd of Hermas, for example, we find a more gradual approach. The emphasis is on moral preparation, on spiritual construction, and on the idea that judgment is related to the state of the soul. In the Didache, we see an expectation of the end, but accompanied by a practical guidance for community life. This indicates that even with an eschatological expectation, there was concern for stability, for continuity, for organization. In other words, the end did not cancel present life. It shaped it. And this reveals an important complexity. The first Christians did not have a single vision of the end of the world, but a set of interpretations that evolved over time. If we move beyond the first decades, we see that the expectation of the end does not disappear, but begins to transform from something immediate to something interpreted, reflected upon, in some cases, reorganized within a new theological structure. One of the factors that drove this change was the historical experience of the Christian communities themselves. Time continued to pass. Generations came and went, and the promise of an imminent end did not seem to be fulfilled as expected. This required a deep re-evaluation, not only of expectations, but of how the teachings of Jesus were understood. Some began to emphasize that the issue was not the promise, but a human interpretation of time. Others came to understand that certain events had already partially occurred, and that the end might be unfolding progressively. This transformation was neither uniform nor immediate, but it is visible in different texts and traditions. An important example of this transition appears in how Revelation was interpreted. This text, filled with symbolic imagery, describes judgments, conflicts, and renewal, but its language does not necessarily point to a single literal reading. Some Christians understood it as a description of the final end. Others saw it as a representation of the ongoing struggle between good and evil throughout history. And there were also those who interpreted it as a veiled critique of Roman power. This reveals something fundamental. The end of the world was not only an event, it was also an interpretive lens, a way of understanding the present, especially in times of crisis. Another element that contributed to this transformation was the development of church structures. As communities grew, the need for organization emerged. for leadership, for doctrine, for continuity. This required a long-term vision, a perspective that extended beyond the immediate expectation of the end. And this led to a delicate balance. On one hand, the eschatological hope remained. On the other, everyday life had to continue. This tension deeply shaped early Christianity and influenced how the end began to be taught, no longer necessarily as something immediate, but as a future certainty without a defined timeline. But this was not the only direction that emerged. In some currents, especially those influenced by more mystical traditions, the end began to be understood in an even more interior way. Not as the collapse of the external world, but as the overcoming of a way of perceiving reality, a kind of awakening, where the old way of seeing dissolves and a new understanding emerges. This reading appears in some texts associated with Gnostic traditions, where the emphasis is on the liberation of consciousness, and not necessarily on a visible cosmic event. But it is important to remain cautious. These interpretations coexisted with more traditional ones, and were not always accepted by the same communities. This reinforces the idea of diversity, of multiple voices trying to understand the same phenomenon. If we observe this process as a whole, a pattern emerges. The expectation of the end does not disappear, but it adapts, shifts, redefines itself, and in many cases deepens. From an event expected at any moment, to a reality involving time, transformation, and interpretation. And perhaps this leads us to an essential question. What did the end of the world really mean for the first Christians? The end of history, a definitive divine intervention, or the beginning of something entirely new? If we go even deeper into this question, we perceive that the end of the world, in the early centuries, was not understood only as destruction. In many cases, it was seen as revelation, an unveiling, a moment when what was hidden would become visible. And this completely changes the meaning of the word end. The very term used in many ancient texts is closer to the idea of fulfillment or completion. That is, not the disappearance of the world, but its revelation. Something that was already underway, but not yet fully perceived. This idea appears implicitly in various passages, especially those that speak of the manifestation of the kingdom of God. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 15, we find the declaration that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is near. This nearness is not only temporal, it is existential, something that can be experienced, something that has already begun, but has not yet been fully realized. And this creates a fundamental tension between the already and the not yet. This tension becomes one of the central elements of early Christian theology. On one hand, it is believed that something decisive has already occurred with the life and message of Jesus. On the other, a future culmination is still expected, a complete manifestation of that reality. This means that for many Christians, the end was not just a final point, but a process, something unfolding over time and involving both the world and the individual. But not all texts approach this question in the same way. In Revelation, for example, we find intense images of judgment, destruction, and renewal, the fall of structures, the emergence of a new heaven and a new earth, the elimination of suffering. These images can be interpreted as future events, but also as symbols of deep transformation, a rupture with what is unjust, and the establishment of a new order. In texts like the letters of Paul, we find a more existential approach, the idea that the old self must die and a new one must arise. This suggests that the end can also be understood at a personal level, as an inner transformation. Something there would not make sense if it were only a distant event, because its implications are immediate. They affect how one lives, thinks, acts. This multiplicity of interpretations reveals something important. The first Christians were not simply waiting for an event to. They were trying to understand the meaning of history itself, the meaning of time, the purpose of existence, and the place of the human being within that process. The end of the world, in this context, becomes an interpretive key, a way of organizing reality, of giving meaning to suffering, of justifying hope, and of guiding life. But there is one final detail that cannot be ignored. Even with all these variations, there is a constant element, the expectation of transformation. Something must change. Something must be revealed. Something must be restored. And this expectation runs through all currents, even if in different ways. Perhaps that is why this theme has remained so present throughout history, because it does not speak only of an ending, it speaks of a deep desire for justice, for meaning, for renewal. And perhaps, in the end, the most important question is not when the world will end, but what that end means within human experience. Whether it points to destruction or to transformation, and to what extent that expectation still shapes how we understand reality today. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.